The news of David's decision to adopt Ethan quickly spread through the small town of Willow Creek. It wasn't long before his parents, Edward and Margaret Anderson, invited him over for a family dinner. As David parked his car in front of their familiar two-story house, he felt a mix of emotions: nervousness, anticipation, and a touch of defiance. The quaint home, with its neatly trimmed hedges and white picket fence, had always been a place of comfort for him. But tonight, it felt different, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the tension that was about to unfold. Inside, the dinner table was set with all of David's favorite dishes: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The aroma was inviting, but his appetite had vanished. As they sat down to eat, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware against plates and the occasional clearing of a throat. David knew his parents well enough to recognize that they were struggling to find the right words. Finally, Edward, his father, broke the silence. "Son, we need to talk about this situation," he began, his voice steady but tinged with concern. David, who had been absent-mindedly pushing food around on his plate, looked up to meet his father's gaze. "You mean Ethan?" David replied, his tone firm. "He's not in a situation, Dad. He's my son." Margaret, his mother, reached out and placed a gentle hand on David's arm. Her eyes, usually warm and comforting, were clouded with worry. "Honey, we're just concerned," she said softly. "Have you really thought this through? Raising a child is a huge responsibility, but raising a black child in Willow Creek, it won't be easy." David felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew this conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I have thought about it, Mom," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I know it won't be easy, but Ethan needs me. I can't just walk away from him." Edward sighed deeply, setting down his fork. "David, we're not saying you should walk away, but you have to understand that this town, it's not always kind to people who are different. Ethan is going to face challenges that you might not be prepared for, and we worry about what that will mean for both of you." David nodded, understanding their concerns but also feeling a deep resolve. "I know there will be challenges," he admitted, "but I can't let fear stop me from doing what I know is right. Ethan is already a part of me. The moment I found him, I knew I was meant to be his father, and I won't let anything or anyone take that away from us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her son. "We just want you to be happy, David," she whispered. "And we want Ethan to have the best life possible." "He will," David assured her, his voice strong with conviction. "Because I will make sure of it. Ethan will grow up knowing he's loved, supported, and protected. And I believe that love can overcome anything, even the challenges we might face here." The room fell silent again, but this time the tension had eased. Edward and Margaret exchanged a glance, and though they still had their concerns, they could see the determination in their son's eyes. They knew that David had made up his mind, and they also knew how deeply he loved the child he had chosen to adopt. Finally, Edward nodded slowly. "If you're sure about this, then we'll support you," he said quietly. "We'll be here for both of you, no matter what." Margaret squeezed David's hand, offering him a small, sad smile. "We love you, David, and we'll love Ethan too." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means the world to me." As they finished their meal, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The tension slowly gave way to a sense of unity as the family began to embrace the new journey that lay ahead. David's sister, Karen, said, "And what about your job, David? You're always at the hospital. How can you take care of a baby?" David felt his face get hot. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm. "I know it won't be easy, but Ethan needs me. I can't explain it, but from the moment I held him, I knew he was meant to be my son." Edward shook his head. "Son, you're not thinking clearly. This town isn't ready for this kind of change. People will talk, and they might treat you differently." "So what if they do?" David's voice got a little louder. Ethan deserves a loving home, and I can give him that. I'll figure out how to balance work and being a dad. Plenty of single parents do it every day. Karen leaned forward, her face full of worry. But David, you're not just any single parent, you're a surgeon. Your schedule is unpredictable. What happens when you're called in for an emergency? David's shoulders dropped. He knew his family meant well, but their lack of support hurt him deeply. I'll make it work, he said softly. I have to. Ethan needs me, and honestly, I need him too. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. We just want what's best for you, sweetheart. Are you sure this is it? David looked at each of their worried faces, feeling more certain. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Ethan is my son now, and nothing will change that. I hope you can all learn to accept him as part of our family. Within days, it seemed everyone in the small town knew about Dr. Anderson's decision to adopt a black baby. The once respected surgeon found himself at the center of hushed conversations and sideways glances. At Mabel's diner, the usual morning chatter was replaced with whispers and guesses. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as regulars gathered around their usual tables, but today their focus wasn't on the daily special. Did you hear about Dr. Anderson? Mrs. Turner leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. He's gone and adopted a black baby. Can you believe it? Mr. Brooks, a retired school teacher, shook his head. It's a shame. He was such a respected man in this town. What could he be thinking? Maybe he's having some kind of midlife crisis, suggested Betty, the waitress, as she refilled their coffee cups. I mean, why else would a single white man want to adopt a black child? The diner buzzed with similar conversations. People who had once praised David's surgical skills now questioned his judgment. Some were concerned, others outright disapproved. It's going to bring nothing but trouble, declared Tom, the local mechanic. This town isn't ready for that kind of diversity. Sarah, a young nurse who worked at the hospital with David, tried to defend him. Dr. Anderson is a good man. Maybe we should give him a chance before judging. But her voice was drowned out by the louder, more critical opinions. The townspeople, set in their ways, found it difficult to understand or accept David's decision. As the day wore on, the rumors grew wilder. Some wondered if David was trying to make some sort of political statement. Others questioned whether he was fit to be a father at all, given his demanding career. The once golden boy of Willow Creek now found himself the subject of gossip and judgment. The town that had once embraced him now seemed to be turning its back, all because of a decision made out of love and compassion. David's world had turned upside down since he brought Ethan home. The once orderly routine of his life was now a chaotic mix of diaper changes, feedings, and sleepless nights. As he walked through the hospital corridors, he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. Dr. Anderson, we need you in O3, a nurse called out, her voice colder than usual. David nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been up most of the night with Ethan, who seemed to cry just as David was drifting off to sleep. In the operating room, David could feel the tension in the air. His colleagues, once warm and supportive, now seemed distant. As he scrubbed in, he overheard whispered conversations. Is he really fit to operate? I mean, with a new baby at home, and not just any baby, you know what I mean. David's hands trembled slightly as he tied his surgical mask. He took a deep breath, pushing away the hurtful comments and focusing on the task at hand. After the surgery, David retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He slumped into his chair, feeling the full weight of his decision. The phone rang, and he answered it with a tired hello. Dr. Anderson, it's Mrs. Thompson from next door. The baby's been crying for an hour. I think your babysitter might need some help. David's heart sank. He glanced at the clock, still 3 hours left in his shift. I'll be right there, he said, knowing he'd face disapproval for leaving early again. As he drove home, David's mind raced. How could he balance being a good father with being a good doctor? The town's judgment, his colleagues' doubts, and his own fears swirled in his mind like a relentless storm. He walked into his house, the sound of Ethan's cries filling the air. The babysitter, a teenager from down the street, looked relieved to see him. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Anderson. I've tried everything, but he won't stop crying." David picked up Ethan, cradling him close. "It's okay, buddy. Daddy's here," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. As the sun peeked through the trees at Willow Creek Park, David pushed Ethan's stroller along the winding path. The fresh air felt good after long days cooped up in the hospital and at home. Ethan cooed happily, his tiny hands reaching for the colorful leaves above. David smiled, his heart swelling with love, but his moment of peace was short-lived. "Well, if it isn't Dr. Anderson and his son," a sharp voice cut through the air. David looked up to see Mrs. Benson, the town's librarian, her lips pursed in disapproval. Beside her stood Mr. Turner from the hardware store, shaking his head. "Dr. Anderson, we need to talk," Mr. Turner said, his voice gruff. "This whole situation, it's not right for our town." David's grip tightened on the stroller handle. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mrs. Benson stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "A child like that, he doesn't belong here. It's not fair to him or to you. What were you thinking?" David felt a surge of anger and hurt. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm for Ethan's sake. "I was thinking that this child needed a loving home, and I could provide that," he said firmly. "But you're not. You know," Mr. Turner stammered, gesturing vaguely. "You can't possibly understand what he'll need." David's voice shook with emotion as he replied, "What Ethan needs is love, care, and support. That's what any child needs, and that's what I'm giving him." A small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with a mix of curiosity and judgment. David felt like everyone was staring at him, making him feel heavy. Mrs. Benson said, "You're making a mistake, Dr. Anderson. You're turning your back on everything this town believes in." David stood tall and looked her in the eyes. "If loving my son and giving him a home means turning away from prejudice and narrow-mindedness, then I'm proud to do it." The following weekend, David sat in his parents' living room, his hands tightly clasped in his lap. Edward and Margaret Anderson, his parents, sat across from him, their faces full of concern. The air was thick with tension as they prepared to discuss what had been bothering them. "David, son," Edward began gently but firmly, "we need to talk about Ethan." David's shoulders stiffened. He knew this conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "What about him, Dad?" Margaret leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Sweetheart, we're worried for both of you. This town isn't ready for a child like Ethan." David repeated, his voice tight. "A child like Ethan? He's my son." Edward sighed heavily. "David, you have to understand, Willow Creek has always been traditional. People here aren't used to change. We're afraid Ethan will never truly be accepted here." David felt a surge of anger, but he fought to keep his voice calm. "So what are you saying? That I should give up my son because some people in this town are narrow-minded?" "We're just asking you to reconsider," Margaret said softly, "for your sake and for Ethan's. This decision could ruin both your lives, your career, your place in this community." David stood up, his emotions boiling over. "My place in this community? Is that what this is about? Keeping up appearances?" "Son, please," Edward pleaded. "We're thinking about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" David's voice cracked with emotion. "What about what's best for Ethan? He needs a home, a family. I'm his father now, and nothing is going to change that." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "David, we just don't want to see you struggle. We love you." David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know you do, but Ethan is my son now. No matter what anyone thinks, I love him, and I'm going to raise him to be a good person, regardless of the color of his skin or what this town thinks." The next day, a knock on David's door broke the quiet afternoon. He opened it to find Mike, his best friend since childhood, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Hey, Mike. Thought I'd drop by and see how you're holding up," Mike said, his voice filled with concern. David stepped aside, letting his friend in. "Thanks, Mike. It's been challenging, to say the least." They settled in the living room where Ethan was napping peacefully in his bassinet. David's eyes lingered on the baby for a moment before turning back to Mike. "Listen, Mike," David began, his tone serious but gentle. "I want you to know I'm here for you, no matter what. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't have some concerns." Mike nodded, bracing himself. "I appreciate your honesty, Dave. What's on your mind?" David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I'm worried about the challenges you're going to face. This town, it's not exactly known for its open-mindedness. Have you really thought about what it'll be like raising a black child here?" Mike's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "I have, Dave. It won't be easy, but Ethan deserves a loving home, regardless of what anyone else thinks." "I get that, I do," David replied, "but it's not just about what people think. It's about the day-to-day reality, the stares, the comments, the potential discrimination Ethan might face as he grows up. And that's not even considering how you'll balance all this with your career." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it won't be easy, but I can't just give up on him because it's hard. He's my son now, Dave." David nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I know, and for what it's worth, I think you'll be a great dad. I just want you to be prepared for the road ahead." "I appreciate that," Mike said bifaswana, feeling a wave of gratitude for his friend's honesty and support. "And I'm glad you're here to talk about this stuff." David reached out, patting Mike's shoulder. "Always, man. I may have my doubts, but I'm here for you both. Whatever you need, just ask." The first few months of Ethan's life at home were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges for Mike. Sleepless nights became the norm as he struggled to balance his demanding career with the needs of his newborn son. The constant worry about Ethan's well-being weighed heavily on his mind, making it difficult to focus on anything else. As the days turned into weeks, the lack of rest began to take its toll on Mike's work performance. His usually steady hands trembled slightly during surgeries, and his concentration wavered during important consultations. His colleagues, once supportive and understanding, started to exchange concerned glances and whispers behind his back. One particularly grueling morning, after another night of little sleep, Mike found himself making a minor error during a routine procedure. Though quickly corrected, it didn't go unnoticed by the watchful eyes of his fellow surgeons. Later that day, as Mike was reviewing patient files in his office, a knock on the door startled him from his exhausted daze. Dr. Collins, his supervisor, entered with a grave expression on his face. "Mike, do you have a moment?" Dr. Collins asked, his voice tinged with concern. Mike nodded, trying to shake off his fatigue. "Of course, Dr. Collins. What can I do for you?" Dr. Collins sat down across from Mike, looking serious. "I wanted to talk about how you've been doing at work. We've noticed some changes since you adopted Ethan. Your coworkers are worried about your focus during surgeries." Mike's heart sank. He had been trying so hard, but the stress was showing. "I'm sorry, Dr. Collins. I know I haven't been at my best. It's been hard adjusting." Dr. Collins leaned forward with concern in his eyes. "I understand, Mike, but as surgeons, we can't let personal problems affect our work. Lives depend on us." Mike rushed through the hospital doors, holding Ethan, who was very sick. Ethan's usually bright eyes were dull, and his small body was burning with fever. Mike's training as a doctor told him this was serious, but as a dad, his emotions were overwhelming him. As he got to the front desk, Mike felt people staring at him, judging him. He heard whispers behind him. "That's Dr. Anderson's adopted son," one nurse said to another with a mean tone. Mike tried to ignore them, focusing only on Ethan's labored breathing. He gently bounced Ethan, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. Daddy's here. We'll make you better. Dr. Lisa Chen, a pediatrician Mike knew, came over with a worried look. Dr. Anderson, what's wrong? Mike explained Ethan's symptoms, his voice shaking. He's had a high fever, and he's barely responding. I don't know what's wrong. As Dr. Chen examined Ethan, Mike noticed her usual warmth was gone, replaced by a cold professionalism that felt like a wall. We need to run some tests, Dr. Chen said sharply. You can wait in the family room. Mike's chest tightened at the thought of leaving Ethan alone. Can't I stay with him? He doesn't know anyone here, and he might be scared. Dr. Chen hesitated, glancing around the room. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Dr. Anderson. Maybe it's better if we handle this. Her words stung, but Mike looked down at Ethan's pale face and knew he couldn't leave. No, Mike said firmly, surprising even himself. I'm staying with my son. He needs me, and I won't leave him alone. Dr. Chen's eyes widened at Mike's strong response, but she nodded and led them to an exam room. As they walked, Mike held Ethan close, feeling the warmth of his little body against his chest. In the bright exam room, under the harsh lights, David's world narrowed down to just him and Ethan. As the nurses worked around them, taking blood and checking vitals, David never let go of Ethan's tiny hand. It's okay, buddy, he whispered, his voice full of emotion. Daddy's right here. As he watched Ethan's face scrunch up in discomfort, David's heart swelled with a love so strong it nearly took his breath away. He knew that no matter what anyone else thought, this child was his son in every way that mattered. The hours passed slowly, and David's worry grew, but so did his determination. He thought about the challenges Ethan would face growing up in Willow Creek. The stares, the whispers, the prejudice. His jaw tightened as he promised himself that he would do everything he could to protect Ethan from the world's cruelty. I'll teach you to be kind, David murmured, stroking Ethan's forehead. To be strong and brave when people are mean. You'll know love and you'll know you're perfect just as you are. As the sun rose, turning the sky pink and gold, Ethan's fever finally broke. David's relief was overwhelming as he held his son, who was now sleeping peacefully. In those quiet moments, as the hospital started to wake up with the morning shift, David knew that everything would be okay. David silently promised that he would be the father Ethan deserved, no matter what challenges they faced. He would show Ethan a world full of wonder and possibilities, not held back by others' narrow thinking. Years passed like pages in a beloved book, and Ethan grew into a bright, curious child with curly hair and sparkling eyes. At 10 years old, he was the center of David's world, bringing joy and wonder in a world that often felt cold and unkind. David balanced his busy job as a surgeon with being a single father. It wasn't easy, but his love for Ethan made every sacrifice worth it. However, the community's disapproval loomed over them like a dark cloud, casting shadows on their happy life. One sunny afternoon, while David pushed Ethan on a swing at the park, he noticed a group of mothers whispering and glancing at them. His heart sank, but he kept smiling for Ethan. Higher, Daddy. I want to touch the sky. Ethan squealed with joy, and David pushed him higher. Just be careful, buddy. I don't want you flying away. Ethan's laughter filled the air, and David felt proud. His son was growing into such a wonderful boy, kind, smart, and full of life. But lately, David noticed Ethan asking more serious questions, becoming more aware. That evening, as David tucked Ethan into bed, the little boy looked worried. Daddy, Ethan began, why do the other kids at school look different from me? And why do their parents look at us funny when we're out? David's heart ached. He knew this day would come, but it didn't make it easier. He sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, gathering his thoughts. Well, Ethan, David began gently, people come in all different colors and shapes. That's what makes the world so beautiful and interesting. You and I may look different on the outside, but what matters most is what's in our hearts. Ethan nodded slowly, thinking about what his dad said. But why do people act weird around us? Ethan asked. David sighed, and ran his hand through his hair. Sometimes, buddy, people are afraid of what they don't understand. They might not be used to seeing families like ours, but that doesn't make our family any less real or important. As weeks went by, Ethan's time at school became harder. The once cheerful boy came home with slumped shoulders and a sad heart. David noticed the change and it broke his heart. One afternoon, Ethan came home with his backpack dragging on the floor. David looked up from his work, worry on his face. "Hey, buddy, how was school today?" he asked gently. Ethan shrugged, looking down. "It was okay, I guess." David knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Did something happen?" he asked. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. "The other kids won't play with me during recess. They say I'm different and don't belong." David felt both angry and sad. He hugged Ethan tightly, feeling his son's small body shake with silent sobs. "Oh, Ethan," he whispered, his voice full of emotion, "you belong here more than anyone. Those kids just don't understand how special you are." As time went on, the situation at school only got worse. Ethan became more withdrawn, and his usual curiosity faded because of the mean words from his classmates. David felt helpless, unsure how to protect his son from the harsh world, while still preparing him for the challenges ahead. One evening, while helping Ethan with homework, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, the school principal, asking for a meeting. David's stomach tightened with worry, but he agreed to meet the next day. The next morning, David sat across from Mrs. Thompson in her office. The room felt tense. The principal's face was serious as she spoke. "Dr. Anderson," she began, her voice controlled, "I called you because we're facing some challenges with Ethan being at our school." David's jaw tightened. "What kind of challenges?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it seems that Ethan's presence is causing some issues among the other students. Some parents are concerned about the disruption to the school environment." David felt a surge of anger. "Disruption? My son is being bullied and left out, and you call it a disruption?" David left Mrs. Thompson's office with a heavy heart and a strong resolve. He couldn't let Ethan continue to suffer in silence. That evening, after giving Ethan extra hugs and reassurances, David made a decision. He would meet with the parents of the children who were bullying Ethan. The next day, he arranged a meeting at the local community center. As he walked into the room, David felt the heavy stares of the parents sitting around the large table. There were 5 sets of parents, and their faces showed that they were upset and not happy to be there. David began, trying to keep his voice steady even though he was nervous. "Thank you all for coming. I wanted to talk about the problems our kids are having at school." One of the dads, a big man named Tom, spoke up. "What problems? Our kids haven't done anything wrong." David took a deep breath. "Your children have been leaving out and bullying my son, Ethan. It's affecting how he feels and how he does in school." The room became very quiet. Then Mara, a mom with perfect hair, leaned forward and said, "Dr. Anderson, maybe the problem isn't with our kids. Maybe Ethan is just having trouble getting along." David felt his anger rising. "Getting along? He's just a child like your kids. He deserves to be treated with kindness and respect." Tom interrupted again with a gruff voice. "Look, we can't help it if our kids notice Ethan is different. It's not their fault." David felt hurt by their words. He looked around the room and saw that some parents were agreeing, while others wouldn't meet his eyes. It was clear that these parents didn't want to talk about the real problem. "Your children are learning this behavior from somewhere," David said, his voice tight with emotion. "By ignoring this problem, you're teaching them that it's okay to treat others this way." The meeting quickly turned into a bunch of defensive arguments and not-so-hidden accusations. As David had left the community center, he felt both frustrated and more determined. The meeting hadn't gone well, but it made him more sure that he would protect Ethan, no matter what it took. In the days that followed, David noticed a change in Ethan. The once lively and curious boy had become quiet and withdrawn. His bright eyes, usually full of wonder, now seemed dull because he felt different from the other kids. One evening, as David tucked Ethan into bed, he saw a single tear roll down his son's cheek. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked gently. Ethan sniffled. "Why don't the other kids like me, Dad?" David's heart broke. He hugged Ethan tightly, feeling his small body shake with silent sobs. At that moment, David knew he had to do something. The next morning, David called the hospital. "Dr. Collins, I need to take a personal day." Then he woke Ethan up with a smile. "Hey, champ, how about we go on an adventure today?" Ethan's eyes widened with surprise and a hint of excitement. "Really? What about work?" "Work can wait. Today is just for us," David replied, ruffling Ethan's hair. They packed a small bag and hit the road, driving to a nearby city. As they entered the busy streets, Ethan pressed his face against the car window, looking at the tall buildings and the different people walking around. Their first stop was a science museum. Ethan's eyes lit up as they explored exhibits about space, dinosaurs, and the human body. David watched with joy as his son's curiosity came back to life, asking questions and getting excited about each new thing they discovered. For lunch, they found a small family-owned restaurant. The owner, a kind woman, smiled warmly at both of them. What a handsome young man you have there," she said to David, making Ethan beam with pride. As they walked through a busy park, Ethan noticed something. "Dad! Look, there are all kinds of families here." David nodded and squeezed Ethan's hand. "That's right, buddy. The world is full of all sorts of people and families, and they're all special in their own way." As David and Ethan drove back to their town of Willow Creek, the sun was setting, painting the sky in warm colors. The day had been a much-needed break for both of them. Ethan's laughter filled the car, a sound David had missed so much. But their peace didn't last long. When they got back to town, David noticed there were more cars than usual parked outside the hospital. His phone buzzed nonstop. It was Dr. Collins. "David, we need you here now. There's an emergency." Dr. Stevens' voice was tense. David's heart started racing. He glanced at Ethan, who was asleep in the back seat. "What's going on?" "There's a strange illness spreading. It's affecting the children, and we're overwhelmed," Dr. Collins explained. David gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I'll be right there." He dropped Ethan off at their elderly neighbor Mrs. Turner's house before rushing to the hospital. The emergency room was in chaos. Parents were holding their sick children, their faces full of worry. Nurses were hurrying back and forth, wearing masks and gloves. Dr. Collins met David at the entrance. "It started 2 days ago. High fevers, severe tiredness, and in some cases, difficulty breathing. We can't figure out what's causing it." David's mind was racing. How many cases? 37 so far, all children. It's spreading fast. As they walked through the hospital corridors, David saw how serious the situation was. In one room, a little girl lay still, her skin pale and sweaty. In another room, a boy was struggling to breathe with an oxygen mask on his face. The panic in the air was strong, and parents were demanding answers, but the doctors didn't have any to give. David overheard people whispering, fear clear in their voices. What if it's some kind of sickness? Why only the children? Is anyone safe? David felt a chill run down his spine as he thought of his son, Ethan, who was safe at home, for now. But how long would that last? The town that once shunned them now faced a big problem that didn't care who it hurt. As David put on his protective gear, he knew the days ahead would test not only his medical skills, but also the strength of their community. One worried parent spoke to Dr. Anderson in the emergency room. "Dr. Anderson, you're the best doctor in town. Please help us save our children." David was stunned and unsure of what to do as a health crisis suddenly hit the town. Many parents begged Dr. Anderson for help because they believed he could save their children in this critical situation. David threw himself into researching the mysterious illness, working day and night in the hospital lab. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but he stayed focused, determined to find a cure for the children of Willow Creek. As the crisis got worse, fear and desperation filled the town. Parents waited in the hospital, their faces full of worry. The once busy streets were now quiet, except for the sound of ambulances. In the lab, David studied test results, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He barely noticed when Dr. Collins came in with a new stack of patient files. "Any progress?" Dr. Collins asked, his voice tired. David shook his head, frustration showing on his face. "Not yet, but I'm not giving up." As they discussed their findings, they heard a commotion outside. Through the window, they saw a crowd near the hospital entrance, their voices loud with anger and fear. "It's the Millers," Dr. Collins said softly. Their twins were just admitted. David's heart sank. The Millers had been very critical of his decision to adopt Ethan. Now their own children were sick with the illness he was trying to cure. For a moment, David felt a bitter irony, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong or seeking revenge. It was about saving lives, all lives. With renewed determination, David turned back to his microscope. As he adjusted the lens, a memory of Ethan's curious face peering through a magnifying glass flashed through his mind. The image strengthened his resolve. Hours passed, and the number of cases continued to rise. The hospital was overwhelmed, with every bed filled. Nurses worked extra shifts, their faces showing exhaustion. Through it all, David persevered. He knew that somewhere in the data, in the countless samples he'd analyzed, lay the key to solving this mystery, and he would find it, not just for Ethan, but for all the children of Willow Creek. As the days went on, Ethan watched his father's tireless work with a mix of awe and concern. The young boy, now 10 years old, noticed the dark circles under David's eyes and the way his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Despite the long hours at the hospital, David always made time to check on Ethan, even if it was just a quick phone call. One evening, when David came home for a short break, Ethan approached him with a determined look in his eyes. "Dad, can I help you with your research?" he asked, his voice serious. David looked at his son, surprised by the offer. "That's very kind of you, Ethan, but this is complicated stuff." Ethan frowned. "I know, but I've been reading about diseases and how they spread. Maybe I can help sort your papers or something." Touched by Ethan's eagerness, David agreed to let him help with small tasks. As they worked together at the kitchen table, Ethan's natural curiosity began to show. He asked questions about the data David was analyzing, showing a surprising ability to understand complex ideas. "Dad, what if the illness is spreading through the water?" Ethan asked one day, his eyes bright with excitement. David paused, considering his son's idea. "That's actually a very good observation, Ethan. We've been focusing on it spreading through the air, but water contamination is definitely worth investigating." As the days passed, Ethan's involvement grew. He spent more time in David's home office, reading medical journals and asking more sophisticated questions. David was amazed by his son's intelligence and deep understanding. One evening, as they reviewed a set of lab results together, Ethan pointed to a pattern in the data that David had missed. "Look, Dad," he said, tracing his finger along the chart. "These numbers seem to go up every time it rains." David's eyes widened as he realized how important Ethan's observation was. It was a key piece of the puzzle that could lead them to the source of the outbreak. As he looked at his son's eager face, David felt a surge of pride and love. Ethan's natural talent for science, combined with his caring heart, filled David with hope. Not just for solving the current crisis, but for the bright future that lay ahead for his remarkable son. As Ethan's involvement in the research deepened, he spent more and more time reading books and articles about local plants. One afternoon, while Dr. David Mercer was busy reviewing patient charts, his son Ethan burst into the room, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Dad, I think I found something!" he exclaimed, holding up a thick book about local plants. David looked up from his work, raising his eyebrows in curiosity. "What is it, son?" he asked. Ethan eagerly pointed to a page in the book that showed a common plant called the Willow Creek lily. "This plant grows all over town, especially near water sources," Ethan said. "What if it's causing the illness we've been seeing?" David's initial reaction was skepticism. He had been a doctor for many years and found it hard to believe that a common plant could be responsible for such a widespread and serious illness. "I'm not sure, Ethan." "That's a pretty big leap," he said. But Ethan was not discouraged. "Look, Dad," he continued, "lily releases pollen in late spring, right when the illness starts, and it thrives in wet conditions, which matches the pattern we saw with the rainfall data." David listened carefully, impressed by his son's logical thinking. Although he still had doubts, he couldn't ignore the possibility. "You might be onto something here," he said thoughtfully. "Let's investigate this further." Over the next few days, David and Ethan began to research the Willow Creek lily in more detail. They gathered samples of the plant from various locations around town and sent them to the lab for analysis. Meanwhile, they combed through historical records of the plant's growth patterns and any previous incidents of illness in the area. To their surprise, they discovered that there had been several cases in the town's history where mysterious illnesses coincided with particularly wet springs, perfect conditions for the lily to thrive. The more they researched, the more plausible Ethan's theory seemed. When the lab results finally came back, they were astounding. The lily contained a unique compound that, when ingested in large quantities, could cause symptoms remarkably similar to those of the current outbreak. David looked at Ethan with a mixture of pride and amazement. "You did it, son," he said. "You might have just solved this mystery." With the breakthrough in hand, David and Ethan threw themselves into testing their hypothesis about the Willow Creek lily. They worked tirelessly side by side in the hospital lab, analyzing samples and running tests. David was amazed at Ethan's dedication and sharp mind, realizing that his son's unique perspective had been key to this potential discovery. As they awaited further test results, David couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. "You know, Ethan," he said softly, "you've done something incredible here. No matter what happens, I want you to know how proud I am of you." Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes shining with happiness and determination. "Thanks, Dad. I just want to help, like you do every day." When the final results confirmed their theory about Lily's role in the illness, the father-son duo felt a rush of excitement and relief. David immediately sprang into action, working on developing a treatment based on their findings. The urgency of the situation was clear. Children all over town were falling ill, and time was of the essence. David and Ethan worked around the clock, pushing themselves to their limits. David's medical expertise combined with Ethan's innovative thinking proved to be a powerful combination. One particularly grueling night, as they pored over treatment options, David noticed Ethan stifling a yawn. "You should get some rest, son," he said gently. But Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad. We're so close. We can't give up now. Those kids need us." David felt a lump in his throat. At that moment, he saw not just his son, but a reflection of his own dedication and compassion. Together, they pressed on, fueled by their shared mission to save the children of Willow Creek. When the first doses of the treatment were administered, David and Ethan watched with bated breath as the initially critically ill children began to show signs of improvement. Their fevers broke and color returned to their cheeks. It was a moment of pure relief and joy for the father and son. Word of their success spread quickly through Willow Creek. Whispers of hope replaced the fear that had gripped the town. However, some people were initially reluctant to give credit to David and Ethan, who had been shunned before. "Did you hear it was Dr. Anderson and his son who figured it out?" one woman said to another. Her friend frowned, unsure. "Really? I can't believe it." As more children recovered, the truth of David and Ethan's contribution became undeniable. Parents of the recovered children approached David in the hospital hallways, tears of gratitude in their eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson," one mother sobbed, clutching his hand. "You saved my little girl." David smiled warmly, placing his other hand over hers. "It wasn't just me," he said softly. "My son Ethan played a crucial role in this discovery." The woman's eyes widened in surprise and softened with newfound respect. As days passed and more children left the hospital healthy and smiling, the tide of public opinion began to turn. People who had once avoided David and Ethan began to show them respect and appreciation, acknowledging the vital role they had played in solving the mystery and saving lives. David and Ethan had made a huge difference for their town, and now many people who had once been unkind to them were coming to seek their help. Dr. Collins, who had once questioned David's dedication, approached him one afternoon with a heavy heart. "David," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I owe you an apology. What you and Ethan have done for this town is truly remarkable." David accepted the apology with a nod. "Thank you, Dr. Collins. It means a lot to hear that." As they walked through the hospital's recovery ward, David felt a new sense of hope. The crisis had shown him and Ethan at their best, and maybe it would inspire Willow Creek to become a better place too. Over time, more and more children began to recover from the mysterious illness that had once overwhelmed the town. The hospital, once echoing with the sounds of crying and coughing, was now filled with the joyful sounds of laughter and reunions. The breakthrough treatment developed by David and Ethan was working wonders. The town was slowly returning to normal, and the story of the father-son duo's success spread quickly. Families who had once avoided them were now reaching out, eager to show their gratitude. The very people who had once whispered cruel things about David and Ethan were now seeking their help and forgiveness. One afternoon, as David and Ethan strolled through the park, they were approached by the Roberts family. Their son, Connor, had been one of Ethan's most persistent bullies. Mrs. Thompson, her eyes red from tears, spoke first. "Dr. Anderson, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking, "we owe you both an apology." Mr. Thompson nodded, his face showing deep shame. "What we did, how we treated you, was wrong. We were ignorant and scared." David noticed Ethan tense up beside him and placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Mrs. Thompson continued, her tears flowing freely. "Connor was very sick. We thought we might lose him. But thanks to you both, he's going to be okay. We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we're asking for it anyway. We need your help because Connor is still weak, and we're scared." David looked at Ethan, silently asking for his opinion. Ethan met his father's gaze and then turned to the Roberts family. His voice was soft but steady as he spoke. "Everyone deserves a second chance. That's what my dad taught me." David felt proud of Ethan's wisdom and kindness. He then turned to the Roberts family, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll help in any way we can, but I hope you remember this moment, not just for Connor's sake, but for all the children in Willow Creek who might be different." The Roberts family nodded eagerly, their eyes showing gratitude and understanding. As David and Ethan walked away, they knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time since Ethan had come into his life, David felt a glimmer of hope for true acceptance in their small town. Later, David stood before the assembled hospital staff, who had once judged him harshly. Now, their faces showed a mix of hope and desperation. Pushing aside his past hurt, David focused on the task at hand. "All right, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "We've developed a treatment that's showing remarkable results. I'm going to walk you through the administration process step by step." As he explained the treatment, he noticed the staff listening intently. Even those who had once been unkind now showed respect. After the briefing, David went to the pediatric ward, where children from families who had opposed him and Ethan were being treated. He reminded himself that these were just children who needed help. Moving from bed to bed, he checked on each child's progress and stopped at little Emily's bedside, ready to offer the care she needed. The town square of Willow Creek was alive with activity. It seemed like everyone had come out for a special event. Bright and colorful decorations hung from the lampposts, and a big stage had been set up in front of the old courthouse. The air was buzzing with excitement and a bit of nervousness. People were talking, laughing, and waiting for something important to happen. In his living room, David Mercer was getting ready. He was standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. He glanced at his watch and sighed. "Maybe we shouldn't go, Ethan," he said, feeling unsure. "It's not too late to stay home." David wasn't sure if they should be a part of this big event. After everything that had happened, he was nervous about how people would react to seeing them there. Thus, Ethan, his young son, was dressed in his best clothes, a nice shirt and khakis. He looked up at his dad with a determined expression on his face. Ethan wasn't nervous at all. He felt that they needed to be there. "Dad, we have to go," Ethan said firmly. "It's important." David raised an eyebrow, surprised by how serious Ethan sounded. "Important? Why do you think that, buddy?" David asked, curious to hear what Ethan had to say. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew he had to choose his words carefully to explain how he felt. "Because it's not just about us," Ethan began. "It's about showing everyone that things can change, that people can be better." He wanted to show the town that even after everything that had happened, they could all move forward and be kind to one another. David felt a warm swell of pride in his chest. His son was so wise beyond his years, and it never ceased to amaze him. He knelt down to be at Ethan's eye level and placed his hands on Ethan's shoulders. "When did you get so smart, huh?" David asked, smiling at his son. Ethan grinned back and said, "I learned from the best, Dad." With that, they headed out to the town square. As they approached, David's anxiety started to grow. The crowd was much larger than he had expected, and he could feel all eyes turning towards them as they walked. He instinctively placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder, wanting to shield him from any negativity. But Ethan walked confidently, not letting the crowd's attention bother him. When they arrived at the stage, Mayor Prescott was already there, waiting to speak. The mayor stepped up to the microphone, cleared his throat, and then said in a loud voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. David Mercer and his son Ethan." The crowd erupted in applause, and David and Ethan made their way to the stage. As they walked, people in the crowd smiled warmly at them, and some even reached out to shake their hands. Once they were on stage, David and Ethan looked out at the sea of faces before them. They saw many familiar faces, people they had known for years. But what surprised them were the expressions on those faces. Some of the people who had once turned away from them, who had been unkind or even cruel, were now beaming with gratitude and appreciation. It was a strange feeling, but it also felt good to see that people were finally understanding and acknowledging what they had done. One of the people in the crowd was Mrs. Turner. Her daughter had been one of the first children to recover, and now Mrs. Turner stood before them with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Anderson, Ethan," she began, her voice shaking with emotion, "we can never thank you enough for what you've done for our community. You saved our children when we had lost all hope." David felt overwhelmed by the sincerity in her voice. He didn't know what to say. For a moment, he was speechless. But then Ethan, who had been standing quietly beside his father, stepped forward. Despite feeling a little nervous, he spoke up, his voice clear and strong. "We're just glad we could help," Ethan said simply. "Everyone deserves to be healthy and happy." His words were simple, but they came from the heart, and they seemed to touch something deep within the crowd. There was a moment of silence as everyone absorbed what Ethan had said. Then the crowd broke into another round of applause, even louder than before. Some people even cheered, and a few shed tears of relief and joy. Mayor Prescott stepped back up to the microphone, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a more serious and solemn expression. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on David and Ethan. "Today we gather not just to celebrate a medical breakthrough," the mayor began, his voice thick with emotion, "but to acknowledge a grave injustice that has plagued our community for far too long." The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word the mayor spoke. Dr. S. David Mercer and his son Ethan have shown us the true meaning of courage and compassion, Mayor Prescott continued. They faced prejudice, exclusion, and hatred from the very people they would later save. On behalf of Willow Creek, I extend our deepest apologies for the pain we have caused. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people exchanged guilty glances. They realized that they had been wrong to treat David and Ethan the way they had. But now there was a chance to make things right, to start fresh, and to build a better, kinder community together. David stood tall, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. "Dr. Anderson," the mayor began, "your dedication to this town, despite how we've treated you and your son, is nothing short of heroic. And Ethan," the mayor's voice softened as he looked at the young boy, "your intelligence and kindness have taught us all an important lesson about looking past our differences." As the mayor's words settled in, something amazing happened. One by one, people in the crowd began to stand. Soon, the entire square was on its feet, clapping loudly, with cheers so strong they seemed to shake the ground. "David! David! David!" the crowd chanted softly at first, but it quickly grew louder until it echoed off the buildings around them. Overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, David felt tears welling up in his eyes. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder, drawing strength from his son's presence. The crowd then turned its attention to Ethan. "Ethan! Ethan! Ethan!" they cheered, their faces beaming with genuine admiration and gratitude. Ethan, not used to being the center of attention, felt his cheeks grow warm. He looked up at his father, unsure of how to react. David gave him an encouraging nod, and Ethan managed a shy wave to the crowd, which only made them cheer louder. As the cheers died down, the formal part of the event shifted to a more personal atmosphere. Families began to approach David and Ethan, their faces showing a mix of gratitude and remorse. The Johnsons, whose daughter had been one of the first to get sick, were among the first to step forward. Mrs. Turner's eyes were filled with tears as she reached out to David. "Dr. Anderson," she began, her voice trembling, "we're so sorry for how we treated you and Ethan. We were wrong, so terribly wrong." David nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and lingering hurt. "Thank you," he said softly. "I appreciate your apology." Mr. Turner, usually a stern-faced man, looked humbled. "We almost lost our Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If it weren't for you and Ethan." Ethan, standing close to his father, watched these interactions with wide-eyed wonder. He'd never seen these adults, who once looked at him with disdain, now approaching with such genuine remorse. Another family, the Brooks, whose son had bullied Ethan relentlessly at school, approached next. Mrs. Farah Brooks knelt down to Ethan's eye level, her eyes red from crying. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said gently, "what you and your dad did for this town, for my Logan, I can't even begin to thank you enough. I'm so sorry for how we've treated you. Can you ever forgive us?" Ethan looked up at his father, seeking guidance. David gave him an encouraging nod, silently conveying that it was okay for Ethan to respond however he felt comfortable. Ethan turned back to Mrs. Brooks and said softly, "It's okay, I'm just glad Logan's better now." His simple, heartfelt response brought fresh tears to Mrs. Brooks' eyes. She reached out and squeezed Ethan's hand gently before standing up. As more families approached, each with their own stories of regret and gratitude, David felt a mix of emotions. The pain of years of exclusion and prejudice couldn't be erased in a single day, but he could see the genuine change in the people around him. As the evening went on, David found a quiet moment to step back and observe the scene before him. His eyes landed on Ethan, who was now surrounded by a group of children, eagerly listening to him explain something with animated gestures. The sight stirred something deep within David, and he felt a wave of memories wash over him. He thought back to that fateful night years ago when he had found Ethan outside the hospital, the tiny, helpless bundle that had captured his heart in an instant. David remembered the fear and uncertainty he'd felt, but also the overwhelming love that had flooded his entire being. The journey since then has been far from easy. David recalled the sleepless nights, the judgmental stares, and the hurtful words they'd endured. He thought of the family dinners turned into tense debates, the whispers in the hospital corridors, and the playground confrontations. Each memory was a testament to the challenges they had faced together. But as David watched Ethan now, confident and kind despite everything he'd been through, he realized how much they had both grown. The trials they had faced hadn't broken them. Instead, they had forged an unbreakable bond between father and son. David thought about the quiet moments they'd shared, reading bedtime stories, working on science projects, and their special trips to the city. He remembered how Ethan's curious mind had blossomed, how his resilience had shone through even in the darkest times. Their recent collaboration to solve the town's health crisis had revealed a new dimension to their relationship. David had always known Ethan was special, but seeing his son's brilliant mind at work, watching him piece together the puzzle that had stumped so many adults, filled David with an indescribable pride. As David stood there, he felt so thankful. Even though their journey was hard, he wouldn't change anything. Every problem, every tear, and every moment of doubt led them to this moment, making them stronger, wiser, and more connected. After the town meeting, Willow Creek began to change. The crisis made people see the unfairness and prejudice that had been hiding in their town. Now, with hearts full of gratitude and minds open to new experiences, the townspeople were ready for change. Mayor Prescott, who apologized at the meeting, led the way. She started new rules to promote fairness and inclusion. She also held town hall meetings to talk about how to make Willow Creek more welcoming. David and Ethan were invited to share their story at one of these meetings. At first, they were unsure, but they agreed because they knew their story could help others understand the harm caused by prejudice. As they stood before their neighbors, David felt proud of Ethan's courage, hopeful for the future, and sad about the years they spent feeling isolated. Ethan spoke first, his voice soft but strong. "I always felt different," he said, "like I didn't belong. But my dad taught me that being different isn't bad. It's what makes us special." His words touched everyone in the room. Parents hugged their children closer, and some wiped away tears as they realized the pain their actions had caused. Inspired by David and Ethan's story, the community started taking real steps toward change. The school board made new anti-bullying rules and added lessons on diversity to the curriculum. Local businesses began offering jobs and internships to people from all backgrounds. A community center was built to celebrate and understand different cultures, and David was asked to be on its board, which he accepted with pride and responsibility. Ethan also became a positive force for change. His classmates who once ignored him now sought his friendship and advice. He started a science club at school where kids from all backgrounds came together to learn. As Willow Creek embraced its new identity as an inclusive community, David and Ethan found themselves healing from past hurts. The town that once rejected them was now a place where they truly belonged. Over the years, Ethan grew into a kind and caring young man. His experiences in Willow Creek taught him empathy and a desire to help others. It wasn't surprising when Ethan decided to become a doctor, just like his dad. One warm summer evening, David and Ethan sat on their porch in the same house that once felt like a fortress against the world. Now it was a place of peace and reflection. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood where children of all backgrounds played together. David looked at his son with pride. "I can't believe you're going to medical school soon," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It feels like just yesterday I was teaching you how to tie your shoes." Ethan smiled, his eyes full of excitement and memories. "I learned from the best, Dad," he replied. "You showed me what it means to heal not just bodies, but also a community." They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thought. David remembered the scared little boy who had faced so much and marveled at the confident young man beside him. Ethan thought about all the challenges they had overcome together and how those experiences made him want to become a doctor. "You know," Ethan said softly, "I used to dream about leaving Willow Creek, finding a place where I'd fit in better. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. This town has come so far, and I want to be part of its future." David nodded, understanding completely. "It's amazing how things can change," he replied. "And you, son, have been at the heart of that change. I couldn't be prouder of the person you've become." David and Ethan decided to take a walk in the park, the same one where they had faced harsh judgment years ago. As they approached, David felt a twinge of nervousness, old memories trying to resurface. But Ethan squeezed his hand reassuringly, and they stepped onto the path together. The park was full of life, children laughing and playing on the swings and slides, their joyful voices filling the air. Parents sat on benches, watching over their little ones. It was a scene of normalcy that had once seemed impossible for David and Ethan. As they walked hand in hand, David noticed something different. Instead of cold stares and whispered comments, they were met with warm smiles and respectful nods. A young mother pushing a stroller smiled at them as she passed. "Good afternoon, Dr. Anderson," she said cheerfully. "Hi, Ethan. Are you excited about medical school?" Ethan beamed and talked with her for a bit about his upcoming studies. David watched, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This simple conversation would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. They continued their walk, stopping to watch a group of children playing soccer. The team was a mix of races and backgrounds, all working together without a second thought. One of the kids waved excitedly at Ethan. "Hey, Ethan, want to join us?" Ethan looked at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead," David said with a smile. As Ethan ran off to join the game, David found a nearby bench and sat down, marveling at the scene before him. An elderly gentleman sat beside him, offering a friendly nod. "You've raised a fine young man there, Dr. Anderson," he said, his eyes twinkling. "This town owes you both a great deal." David felt a lump in his throat as he watched Ethan laughing with the other kids, fully accepted. The love between father and son was strong, a force that not only strengthened their bond, but also helped transform the entire community.